Thank you.
Thank you guys. All right, it looks like everybody is in from the waiting room. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Tech Tuesday. My name is Vanessa with ITS Communications, and today we're talking about OMOP with Evan and Sajad from ITS Research Informatics. Before we begin, if you're new to Tech Tuesday, welcome, and if you've been here before, also welcome. Because we're expecting quite a few people at today's session, I do have everybody's mics muted just to prevent any, distracting background noises. But if you do have a question at any point during the session, please feel free to type it in the chat. Sajad will be trying to answer as many questions as he can during the presentation, and we may stop periodically to answer your questions as well. You can also raise your hand and we can get to you as soon as there is a break in the session. I'm also recording today's session, so later on, you'll be getting a follow-up email from me with the email that you registered with for this session. It'll have a link to the video recording as well as any other links that might be brought up during the presentation so that you can go back and refer to it when you decide you want to explore the tool a little more. So without further ado, I am going to pass it off to Evan. Evan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Vanessa. Can everyone hear me okay? Is my audio coming through all right? Wonderful.
Yes, great.
All right. Well, thanks again for the introduction, Vanessa. My name is Evan Scholl. I'm the Assistant Director of Research Informatics Data Science Services in the Research Informatics Division. I'm also a lecturer in the Division of Health Informatics in the Department of Population Health Sciences. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today is an initiative called Odyssey and the OMOP Common Data Model. And as Vanessa mentioned, please feel free to break in with questions. Sajad will be, has graciously agreed to try and field some of the questions in the chat as they come up. If you'd also like to break in, please feel free to raise your hand, and then we'll acknowledge you. And you can unmute yourself and ask your question verbally as well. And try to really, run through the slides. And I really would love to hear some user input. So, or feedback, questions, anything people have that comes to mind, please don't be shy about raising it. With that said, let me dive right in. So I don't think it'll come as any surprise to anyone here to learn that research needs reliable data. In order to do good research, you need to, sorry, I'm getting a little bit of sound. Sorry, I'm just gonna. Oh, there we go. Great. Thanks so much. So I don't think it'll come as any surprise to anyone to learn that good research needs good data. And we do a lot of different things with data. You can get approval for new drugs, new devices. Sometimes pharmaceutical companies need to do surveillance to figure out, whether drugs are effective. The FDA also engages in sort of large-scale research of drugs to see which are safe, unsafe, need to be pulled from the market. And ultimately, researchers here at Weill Cornell use this data to figure out the best ways to take care of patients. So it's really important for all of this that the data you have, be reliable, correct, accurate, complete, so that you can use it to do all these really cool things. Clinical operations too. It's not just researchers who need good data. The people who are running the hospital need to make decisions about how to allocate equipment, how to allocate staff. We need to be able to provide decision support to clinicians so that they know how to handle complex cases and so they have the full sort of benefit of all the knowledge and experience of the research community. Machine learning is developing ever quickly. As these interventions come back into the point of care, they all fundamentally depend on really good data, on really high quality data. So when we think about where this data comes from, where healthcare researchers and analytics teams are getting their data from, there are a number of different sources, and there are a lot of different ways that you can get this data. And pretty much for a long time, and still today, one of the most common ways that people get this kind of data is by going to insurance companies. Because we've structured our health system in such a way that private entities, companies sort of pay for most of the care we get. In most cases, some people are covered by Medicare, Medicaid. We have this system such that the person who's best situated to say, what's happening to you across the entire picture of all of your clinical care is really your insurance company. So claims data, as we call that, is one of the sources that people have used for a long time. EHR data is like the data that people enter into Epic every day here at Weill Cornell, that's another really important source of data. And historically, people have always used that as a, an opportunity, or tried to use that as an opportunity to say, well, we're entering all this data to get, for billing and to take care of patients. Maybe we can use this for research and analytics as well. And then the third area has always been, gathering the data by hand, opening an Excel spreadsheet and recording the variables that you want to record yourself. It's often sort of the first thing people think of when they think about doing a study. Is not, rather than reusing existing data, just capturing it yourself. And each of these strategies has its own strengths and weaknesses. The claims data are great for a lot of things. Again, because of the way we've structured healthcare in this country, if you get care at Weill Cornell and then you go across town to NYU, get care at NYU, maybe you fly to the West Coast, get cared for at a community hospital in California, all of that data about what happened to you is still pretty much locked up in the healthcare systems that provided that care. So the insurance companies can provide you a really sort of broad view of what happened. The insurance companies, they process the claims from all three of those healthcare systems, but the data they get are shallow. The claims data they don't really go too far in detail into what actually happened to the patient. Pretty much all you get in an insurance claim is, what did we do to the patient? And that's usually a CPT code, which is a code for a specific procedure, like a inpatient hospitalization with this level of care, or a foot amputation, or intubation, whatever. It's a procedure. What did we do to the patient, and why did we do it? And that why did we do it is usually a diagnosis. So you're not really getting much more than that. You might get some information about where the care happened, et cetera. But you're going to get it from everywhere. The EHR data are much deeper, and they go far down. You can get lab values. You can read the notes about, and figure out how long the patient spent in this unit before they went to that unit. But it's narrower in that we only have data from the systems that generated it. So for example, like here at Weill Cornell, we have our Epic instance. Now that we're live with the NYP sort of shared Epic Together universe, we have data from everyone who's seen at Columbia, the regional hospitals, NYP Queens, Brooklyn Methodist, et cetera. But we don't have data from NYU. We don't have data from Stanford across the country. We don't even have data from the New York, HHS, which is the community hospitals here in New York City. So it's fragmented. And then the last technique of getting data, the sort of manual abstraction, manual data capture. You get really good quality data. You get exactly what you need, but it doesn't scale. The effort required to generate those data sets is really sort of intensive and exhaustive. And what you end up with is built for purpose. It's very specifically tailored to one specific study, and you're not going to really be able to reuse it, except maybe in some rare circumstances for another study. So each of these sources of data has their own strengths and weaknesses. And regardless of whether or not you've managed to somehow enter some dream universe where you have full data from all three sources, the formats are totally different across the board. The claims data might be stored in one format. Maybe it's one giant table with a row for every claim that's ever been filed. Maybe the EHR data is stored in 400 different tables with a different row representing a different thing in each one. There's no common format. There's no sort of common way to tie these together. So what's the solution, and why should we care? So just to dive first of all into a little bit around why we should care, the sort of legislative and federal, the landscape around a lot of this stuff has been changing drastically over the past 10 or 15 years. And the 21st Century Cures Act, which was passed under President Obama, really sort of put a jolt into this space and really encourage people to start thinking about new ways to get data. Because one of the things that act instructed people to do, and instructed the FDA specifically to do, was to evaluate the use of something called real-world evidence for new drugs, for sort of post-approval study requirements, and really ultimately for anything they want. And this was sort of a big watershed moment because up until this was passed, the only way to get a new drug approved or to get a new indication for an approved drug was to run a clinical trial. And going back to this slide, a clinical trial is really sort of the epitome of this manually adjudicated data. For a clinical trial, you're spending a lot of money to gather a lot of data points very carefully. You're usually paying full-time employees to enter those data points manually into a laptop that the study sponsor provides. And those studies are expensive. The average clinical trial in 2018, I think, cost $19 million. They're very, very pricey to run, and they're time consuming and effortful and demanding. So if there's the opportunity to use this real world evidence to do this, it's obviously a really lucrative opportunity. And actually, the first FDA approval based on the sort of real world evidence, and real world evidence is sort of a catch-all term referring to claims data, electronic health record data, anything that doesn't come from a clinical trial, really. The first FDA approval for a new indication for a drug came in April 2019. For a long time, there was no on-label sort of approved treatment for men with breast cancer, but there is a drug called palbociclib. It's a very sort of markedly effective drug. Was being used off-label to treat men with breast cancer, and a company called Flatiron was able to present electronic health record data to the FDA, demonstrating that palbociclib or Ibrance is effective and safe in men with breast cancer, and the FDA approved it and issued the indication. And this was sort of a watershed moment, and people are seeing that this kind of data, data from EHR systems, from claims. It can be used in the real world, and it can be used to create real advances and move things forward in actuality. Just to reiterate, a formal definition of real world evidence, real world data. This nice article from the New England Journal of Medicine has a lot more authority than I do, and they define it as anything that comes from outside the typical sort of clinical trial, randomized trial format, and that includes the HR data, claims data. It includes your Fitbit or your Apple Watch, whether or not you're closing your rings every day. I know some of you are probably very diligent about that. Really anything that falls outside of that traditional randomized controlled trial world. So how do we implement this here, and how do we try and bring together real world evidence here at Weill Cornell? This is the slide that pretty much runs over what we have, what we make available, and how we provide it to people. And this is our sort of real world evidence. We're not an insurance company, so we don't get claims. I guess technically we are self-insured for employees, but we don't get access to that data. What we do have is a massive wealth of EHR data that we transform and optimize for research reuse. We get data from all over the NYP system, all the sort of Weill Cornell affiliated regionals, including Queens and Brooklyn. We have genomics data. We have links to REDCap, to the clinical trials management system. We do all sorts of data enrichment on top of this to make things sort of better. We do natural language processing to extract meaning from clinical free text. We do geocoding to figure out where our patients live and connect that to regional or social determinants of health data sets. And ultimately, we sort of bring this all together into one common landscape. But we're still faced with this problem of everything existing in a different format. We bring in data from Epic, from Allscripts, from Athena Health, from all the different imaging systems, and each one of them comes in its own proprietary, unique format. And each one of them, I promise you, is a special and unique snowflake. And you have to really get acquainted with it to learn the nuances of it, to learn which tables contain which data points, to learn how to connect them together. And not having sort of a common representational framework is a really sort of significant barrier to doing any large scale analytics with this data. So these federated data models, which includes OMOP, as well as some of the other initiatives we participate in, these are really our attempt to answer this question. And to dig into this, I want to sort of frame the scope of the problem a little bit more. The EHR data that we're working with, our real world evidence, is the data from the EHR. These systems were not designed with research and analytics in mind. They weren't even really designed with clinical care in mind. It was as an afterthought. These are systems designed for billing. The very first EHR system we used at Weill Cornell, to my knowledge, was something called IDX. IDX is a piece of software IBM started offering in the 90s, and it was billing software. It was the way that the physician organization was able to get paid for the services that our physicians were providing to patients. Clinical care, it's nice. It's good to be able to do that. It's good to be able to help take care of patients. Research is really, really a distant third when it comes to use cases for these applications. The data are captured, like I said, in a million different systems. Now, in a post Epic Together world, we're all using Epic Together. Before of 2020, there were at least 5 or 6 different EHR systems in use across the healthcare system, each one of which was using its own database structure, its own schemas, its own tables, its own columns. All of those, were sort of disparate. And when you think about things like imaging data and start bringing in data from the PACS, all these other ancillary systems that communicate with our EHR, it becomes a really baffling challenge. So Odyssey is one of the ways that sort of institutions across the country have come together to try and address this problem. And a lot of the approaches that we take to try and solve this problem are really informed by this consortium and its practices and approaches. Odyssey stands for Observational Health Data Sciences and Informatics. It's also an allusion to Homer's The Odyssey, which really, I can't stress this enough, provides the opportunity for some god-awful puns. Every tool that comes up in this ecosystem gets named after something with Greek mythology, and they come up with the name first, and then they figure out the acronym afterwards. So you come up, you're Calypso, and it'll be like, conditional logic applying your population study outcomes. It's pretty funny sometimes. But Odyssey is the consortium that runs this, and Odyssey is centered out of Columbia. Our colleague uptown on 168th Street in the Department of Biomedical Informatics. We're involved with the creation and maintenance of this foundation, but it was really created in consortium with academic medical centers, the government, specifically the FDA, and then pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies. And the idea is that Odyssey constitutes this large collaborative designed to unlock the data of all this unlock the value of all this big data that we're all sitting on. The idea is that healthcare organizations are generating and storing massive volumes of data and don't really have a clear idea of how to analyze it all. Pharmaceutical companies have a vested interest in accessing that data to try and find patients who are eligible for trials, or figure out which drugs are working. The government has a vested interest in accessing this data so that they can figure out which drugs are safe and which might need to be pulled from the market. So why doesn't everyone work together to come up with a common framework for analytics? And that's what they did. The original sort of iteration of this project was called OMOP, the Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership. And that was really a partnership, between pharma, the government, and healthcare organizations. The original OMOP grant expired. Some administrative, issues happened, and they got reconstituted as Odyssey, and that's really what it is today. And the cornerstone of Odyssey is something called the OMOP Common Data Model, and you'll still hear it referred to as OMOP to this day, even though the OMOP name is defunct, because it's a widely known and used standard in the field. And this picture, this graph, really sort of epitomizes OMOP, better than any words can. The analogy I often use, and I've stopped using this to an extent because I usually get blank stares when I bring it, is that of Esperanto. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with Esperanto. There's 50 of you on the call. I'm hoping there's at least one person who knows what Esperanto is. But Esperanto was all right, we got Dr. Margolis, nice. Esperanto was an effort in the 60s and 70s by a utopian social theorist to try and solve world hunger, world war, by creating a common language that everyone would speak. And the idea is we would take little bits of Spanish and French and English and German and Chinese and Arabic and Swahili and Pashto and mash them up into one common language. And OMOP is sort of like that, but for data. So you can envision each of these pink and purple boxes on top as data about patients coming from a source. Maybe the first one is our instance of Epic. Maybe the second one is Aetna's big table with all the claims that Aetna has about patients who for whose care it's paid for. Maybe the third one, is a registry or a private, project that an investigator is maintaining. Maybe it's a clinical trials database. The idea is that we transform all of these various sources into one common data model. And even within EHR systems, there is no sort of standardized framework for this. We use Epic. Epic has a proprietary data model called Clarity. Allscripts has a very different proprietary data model. The Epic table that has all the visits is called PADANC. The Allscripts table is called CV3 client visit. There's no common vocabulary for that. OMOP provides that framework. OMOP says, here's the target. You're going to create X tables. You're going to pop, these are the columns that each one is going to have. These are the types of data that are going to go into each column. And you all, meaning the sites who maintain this data and wish to participate, are going to transform your data into that format so that we can run analysis on any one of the data sets that have been transformed without having to share data across sites. And that is really, really huge. I can't stress how important and useful that is. One of the most common sort of obstacles that, that comes into play here, in addition to the technical obstacles associated with, with running these analyses across sites, is the regulatory and administrative obstacles. Think about trying to, conduct a study with 14 different sites. You need to get IRB approval from 14 different IRBs. You're going to need to get patients. You might need to consent patients across that. Using this technique, I can write code here, or someone from Stanford can write code at Stanford, run it against their instance of the OMOP Common Data Model, get their results, find their findings, and then send us their code so that we can execute it here against our copy of the data model. We can look at our own aggregate findings, not even necessarily any patient level data, maybe just like a summary file saying that 43% of patients with condition X experience complication Y. We can then discuss that with our colleagues, adjust it, refine it. The patient level data never needs to leave the institution. At the bottom of this OMOP Common Data Model and inside these little white boxes, inside the larger blue boxes, there's real patient data in there. There's medical record numbers, there's dates of service, there's diagnoses, there's procedures, labs, medications, so on and so forth. It's all very sensitive data. Some of my data is in there. I'd be willing to bet that a good amount of your data is in there as well. So we really want to be as careful as possible about ensuring that people who don't need to have access to it don't get access to it. So OMOP also provides a really nice framework for that sort of minimum necessary level of disclosure to take place, while still enabling some of these large studies that you need access to large amounts of data to do. So this is what's in OMOP. This is sort of the raw specifications. I took this directly from the wiki page that the consortium offers. And each one of these little white rectangles represents a table. And it represents a table that exists on the servers that our group maintains today. And we provide access to a number of biostatisticians, clinicians, researchers, access to these tables of data today. And people are using this on a daily basis. They're writing queries against it. They're extracting files from it, analyzing them in statistical environments. I'll get into that part a little bit more. This looks complex, and it is complex. I'm not going to try and minimize that or lie about that. What I will say to try and place this into context is that if you were to try and create a similar document to this describing Epic's proprietary data model, my computer screen would not be enough room to fit it. The side of this building would probably not be enough room to fit it. Like I said, there are, I think about 20,000 tables in the raw sort of Clarity Epic data schema. Diagnoses alone, there are at least 6 different tables I can think of off the top of my head in Epic that contain diagnosis data, depending on whether the diagnosis is coming from a problem list or a medical history observation, or whether it was billed from a hospital admission. If it was billed from an outpatient visit, it comes into a separate table. There's a lot of sort of very careful sorting that goes into play. In OMOP, there's one table. It's called condition occurrence. It's got a row for every diagnosis, regardless of where it came from. Same thing with labs, procedures, drug exposure. So drug exposure is another really good example. There are a lot of different ways that patients get medications. One way is to have a prescription written at an outpatient encounter. Another is to have, a drug actually administered during a hospital visit, where one of our nurses is actually coming in and putting the drug into your veins or handing you a cup with a pill to swallow. All of that data, again, stored differently in the source systems. There's a lot of sort of proprietary knowledge, a lot of training you have to do to be able to query that. OMOP makes that digestible and immediately usable for statisticians without the need to engage with these proprietary tools from the EHR vendors. And like I said, this also affords us the opportunity to integrate our analysis with people from other sites. So you can see here in green, there's these tables called standardized health economics with payer plan periods, costs. We don't populate those tables here at our site because we're not a health insurance company, but a company like Aetna or Blue Cross Blue Shield that's working with a large claims data set, they might populate these because they have a sense of how much each visit cost. Conversely, they may not be able to populate something like the measurement table or the note table because they don't run a healthcare system and they don't have access to that in the EHR. But by merging these data sets together and by using this common framework, we're enabling the kinds of analytics that don't depend on people having access to the raw data, and they don't depend on retailoring the code for each specific site's data availability. One thing I want to also sort of highlight here is this orange table on the side, the standardized vocabularies. One of the sort of most excruciating and troublesome and vexatious problems with using EHR data for research is how much variation there is in terms of how people express different concepts. You might get 10 different clinicians who might use 10 different words to describe a disease. OMOP tries to solve all this by relying on what we call standardized reference terminology. And what that means is that in the EHR, when a clinician is assigning you a diagnosis, that diagnosis is getting mapped out to terms in vocabularies. ICD-10 is one of these. You may have heard the term ICD-10 before. ICD-10 is a controlled vocabulary maintained by the World Health Organization that denotes what a condition is. Dysthymia, for example, is a moderate form of depression. You might hear 10 different clinicians refer to dysthymia 10 different ways. A couple people might say dysthymia, some might say moderate depression, some might say what. There is an ICD-10 code for dysthymia that removes that ambiguity, flattens it out. Every time a clinician is entering a diagnosis into Epic, that diagnosis is getting mapped to an ICD-10 code. That code is what we're using in OMOP to represent, what the condition was. Similarly, for drugs, there's something called an RX norm code. This flattens out a lot of the ambiguity around brand names. Midazolam is a sedative drug that we use. It's also called Versed as the trade name. You don't have to worry about, is it stored in the database as Versed or Midazolam, because the way that we're defining all of this is using reference terminology. This makes it a little bit more complicated, but it's a worthwhile sacrifice because it allows you to ask these questions in a regular fashion so that they're applied the same way to all the different sites, regardless of what the individual practices are about how data are actually entered into the EHR. Most EHR systems support these reference terminologies now, in large part because of federal legislation implemented shortly before the 21st Century Cures Act that forces EHR systems to support that degree of functionality. So again, this schema is really the core of it. OMOP is what we call a relational data model. I can see that there are a lot of folks in the audience who are sort of PIs on grants and first authors on papers. And for those of you who are doing research in the field, you're probably used to working with the flat file, a statistical flat file where you have one row per patient, one row per visit with sort of columns reflecting all the analyses or all the variables you want to incorporate into your analysis. So you might have one column that says diabetes with a 1 if they have diabetes and a 0 if they don't. You might have another column that says highest creatinine after admission. This OMOP is not that. There is no sort of one flat file to rule them all. There's no flat file anyone could ever build that would address every study anyone would ever want to do. What this is a tool that you can use to build multiple flat files like that. Using the OMOP Common Data Model, statisticians can write queries in SQL. They can merge data sets in R, SAS, Python, Stata to create those final statistical flat files. This is sort of the last step before that file is assembled. It's also very common for folks to want to integrate data from something like OMOP with data that are gathered in other ways. So we can help people sort of connect data that are gathered in REDCap to OMOP. So for example, if you have 16 variables for your project, 14 of which can be extracted automatically through the EHR and 2 of which require someone to go in and do chart review, you can even pair the data together and build a flat file from OMOP that has the first 14, then extract your REDCap data for the last 2 and stitch the file together. So this does afford a way to sort of make that process of assembling your final flat file for analysis much more straightforward and simple. The goal is really to avoid having people spending time entering into Excel spreadsheets or REDCap projects what someone's hemoglobin was. There's no need for that to happen. The hemoglobin values are all stored in the database. It's one row per hemoglobin value with a column for the MRN. That's much easier than and less time consuming than having someone go in and pull all those values out by hand. All right. So, short of having everyone log onto our SQL server and start to explore, I think that might be a bit of a tall order. I'm going to go into a little bit more about how we do this and what downstream services it supports. So this slide is probably the greatest oversimplification in the history of mankind. This red cylinder in the middle that says aggregate and integrate is hand waving over approximately I don't know, Bo Fold, who's on the call, would know better than I would, but a few hundred scripts written and maintained by a whole team of people. This aggregation and integration process by which we populate OMOP is a big, complex lift. We're taking data from legacy EHR systems, including Allscripts and CompuRecord, all these systems that the hospital used to use before Epic. We're taking all of the Epic data that we get, and we're regularizing it into this format. This is a very sort of computationally intensive job. It requires a lot of processing power. It requires a lot of human power to sort of maintain and upkeep. But what we're left with is a series of tables that exist in our SQL Server environment that people can then either query directly or that we can feed to any of these downstream analytic tools that the Odyssey Consortium has made available to us. And I just want to go back a little bit to this slide. And what I'm talking about now is really these yellow squares on the bottom, this analysis method, because now once the data have been sort of instantiated in this format, it can then be subject to analysis. So there are a few different tools by which people can analyze this data. There are a few platforms that the Odyssey Consortium has provided, mostly as R libraries that let you do some sort of top-level exploration. There's a tool called Achilles, another one called the Data Quality Dashboard, and Patient Explorer with an R capitalized because it's an R package. These are tools that allow you to do some, sort of top-level data exploration, especially useful if you don't know much SQL. There are also a number of R packages that let you do some pretty granular analysis, including case series, self-controlled cohort studies. You can even do some machine learning, patient level prediction. There's some built-in models there that use some of the sort of more common techniques for training these models. You can do some sort of high-level clinical characterization as well. You can, figure out if you have enough patients to launch a study. You can compare the demographic characteristics of two populations to each other. These are all R libraries, and each one of these is a link to various GitHub pages that the consortium maintains that allow you to do this. They provide an analytic framework to do these kinds of studies, and those are all well and good. And this is, this slide I think is a good example of some of the questions you can use this to ask and answer. Among newly diagnosed AFib patients, who's going to go on to have ischemic stroke? That is a study you could build using one of these R libraries. And while that's all well and good, I think direct SQL Server access is really sort of the meat and potatoes of what we do. And this is actually a screenshot I just took this morning and added to provide a little bit more context of what this actually looks like. It made very clear, careful that there's no actual patient data displayed here. This screenshot shows Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. This is the platform that we typically use to engage with data, but we are providing this data on a raw level for statisticians and analysts to engage with. That means you can use a SQL Server client. If you're more comfortable in R, you can use something called RODBC to pull the data in directly as a data frame. There are techniques in SAS and Stata for doing the same thing. In Python, there's a library called PyODBC that lets you bring this data in to your Python analytic environment. But that's really sort of the meat and potatoes of what we're providing here is access to this rows and columns level data derived from the electronic health record. We typically use SQL to query and interrogate this data. Many of the statisticians who work with the data have found it helpful to learn a little bit of SQL. SQL is not a terribly difficult language to learn. It's like that game Mastermind, and it's easy to learn, difficult to master. We've had a lot of success. We've seen a lot of clinicians even have success, starting to learn how to use SQL to do some basic interrogation and manipulation of the data. But ultimately, we want this in the hands of statisticians. That's really the goal here of anyone who's doing statistical analysis, regardless of whether their job title is, resident, fellow, statistician, whatever. We want this in the hands of people who are going to be able to use it, and that's the primary, method by which we provide it. So these tools that I was talking about earlier, the patient level prediction platforms, these all provide sort of an abstracted level of analysis. These are asking you to sort of plug in your parameters, and it's spitting out like a pre-canned analysis. And that can be really valuable, especially if you understand what they're doing. But I think there's no substitute for actually engaging with the rows and columns of data you're working with and understanding what each one means. And our group, is available always to sort of support people, as they try and figure out, how the data we provide, what it means, how it fits together, how it adds up. We have one question in the chat. Sorry, Sajad, I know you're going to try and answer it. I'll try and answer it verbally. Unfortunately, right now, we don't have access to the data from the Hospital for Special Surgery, so we haven't been able to make that available in the OMOP Common Data Model. If as an HSS investigator, if you have an IRB protocol from the Weill Cornell IRB authorizing you to access data from Weill Cornell patients, we can make this available to you either through the data core or if you have a Weill Cornell seaweed directly from your tag machine. So the short answer is we don't have data from HSS, but HSS users can access this under certain circumstances. All right, back to this question about direct data access. Yeah, so again, I think using these tools, these R packages that the consortium has provided, can be a valuable process. But engaging with the raw data on a rows and columns basis and working with the statistician to really understand what it means, I think ultimately ends up being the best way to work with this data. So what are some of the next steps we're going to take? So one step here, and I want to specifically call out the efforts of Marcos Davila from our team, who's been really taking the lead on this, is creating a sort of simplified or more accessible view of OMOP. OMOP is a lot simpler than the raw proprietary data models that the vendors provide, but it still requires a bit of knowledge to interpret and understand. And that use of standardized reference terminology sometimes can throw new users for a loop. Because what you see when you're loading an OMOP table is not like a human readable diagnosis. So take the condition occurrence table, for example. This table has one row for every diagnosis that's been assigned to a patient. When you pull up that table and access it, you're not seeing a human readable term. There's nothing that says heart failure or, colon cancer. What you're seeing is a concept ID that represents a reference terminology item, like a SNOMED code or an ICD-10 code. So what OMOP Simple does is it sort of pre-digests the data a little bit. So it does some of the joins between the tables, some of the stitch work that's required to say this concept ID referring to a condition, this is actually, this ICD-10 code and this name. And it does some of that work already to sort of do the pre-processing so that immediately on inspecting it, on looking at the top 1,000 rows or the top 100 rows, you'll be able to see right away what each one represents without having to do any further querying, any more lookups, any more, investigation into the tables. We're also working on putting together a totally de-identified version of this data model. OMOP as it stands, is not de-identified, and in no small part because in order to truly de-identify something, you need to remove dates. And a lot of the questions we get from researchers and clinicians, a lot of the research projects we work on often depend on, when things happen to people. When was someone admitted to the hospital, so on and so forth. That said, there's a lot of value to having a de-identified instance of OMOP. So it's another thing we've been working on is trying to create an instance of this that is truly de-identified. Allow for easier collaboration across different sites. If we ever do need to send data out, it's also in keeping with this principle of minimum necessary disclosure. Like I said, my data is in there too. I've received a whole bunch of healthcare at Weill Cornell. I'm just as invested as anyone in ensuring that we're not disclosing this unless we absolutely need to be. Just looking at the chat a little bit. Thank you, Sajad, again for answering that. Yeah, as Sajad mentioned, we're always happy to provide technical training sessions. Oftentimes we arrange for these on an ad hoc basis with individual statisticians or through existing project meetings. but we're always happy to help here, and I would encourage anyone to reach out to us through Arch support. And Sajad, if you don't mind putting the Arch support email address in the chat as well. If you'd like to learn more about this tool, if you'd like to get training, learn more about how to get access, you can reach out to us, and we'll provision you an account, and we can. Well, we may not be able to provision you an account unless you have an IRB protocol that authorizes you to access the data, but we can at the very least discuss what's available and how you can gain access. I just want to give a really, a particular shout out to the team that builds and maintains this. Our research informatics data and software engineering team headed up by Bo Fold with Joey Cabariti as manager. It's a lot of people who put a lot of work into making this happen. This is a really sort of exhaustive work, populating these tables, doing what we're eliding in this red cylinder is a massive undertaking, and it's a really, really complex one. It often involves navigating encounters across different systems, bringing large volumes of data in. It's a really, really big job, and we have a really great team of folks who spend a lot of time working really hard to make sure that it works. That takes me about to the end of my prepared materials. I would love to sort of open the floor to any questions. I know we had a couple come in through the chat. If you're feeling particularly bold and brave, feel free to raise your hand or take yourself off mute and pipe up as you see fit. Thanks, Dr. Bolas. Thanks, Euphemia.
While I'm gonna give a little time for questions as well, but just for anybody who came in a little later, I just wanted to remind you that we are recording the session, so we'll be sure to send you a copy of it later today via email. I do know that Sajad has also posted some links and an email in the chat to contact our Arch group for support, so I'll also make sure that you get that information as well. Are there any questions or anybody who wants to maybe ask it over the mic so we can unmute you? Feel free to raise your hand in the reactions button. Oh, you just got one.
Okay, great. Yeah, Teresa, absolutely, for sure, 100%. So Teresa asked if we have an approved IRB protocol for retrospective chart review, can we reach out to your team for help accessing data sets? Yeah, absolutely. That's so really the primary criteria we look at for whether or not people can access this is, do you have an IRB protocol that either has a HIPAA waiver and waiver of informed consent, or have these patients consented to give their EHR data? That's once that's the case, we can definitely talk about how to pull data for patients for particular studies. Another really interesting question from Bruce about whether companies ever want access to this, and the short answer is yes, very badly, all the time, and we spend a lot of time thinking very carefully about how we give access to the data to them. So one example of this is a company we work with called Trinetics. Trinetics is a company that essentially provides to pharma access to a search engine of patients. And the idea is that with Trinetics, you can build a query that sort of models your clinical trials eligibility and exclusion criteria, and then run a query to see which of the participating sites in their network have patients and how many patients meet their criteria. It's a really delicate dance. Obviously, we don't want to hand pharma large volumes of patient data, but there are significant benefits that can accrue to our patients through these opportunities. We actually end up hearing about a lot of clinical trial opportunities that we wouldn't otherwise know about, but because we participate in this. So it's a delicate dance. We want to make sure we're emphasizing patient privacy. Something like Trinetics is something that we are comfortable as an institution participating in because A, there's no data leaving the institution. Patient information is never actually getting shared with pharma, just these aggregate counts of like, Weill Cornell has 120 patients who might be eligible. And B, because like I said, there's direct benefit that accrues back to patients in terms of having access to new, investigational therapeutic agents they might not otherwise be able to have access to. So another really great question, a difference between this and I2B2. They're similar in a lot of ways. So ITB2 really is designed to have a sort of a graphical user interface. And the way we have it built out here at Weill Cornell, it's less designed to help people get rows and columns of patient data and more designed to help answer questions like how many patients X. So OMOP right now doesn't really have a web tool that you can use to just sort of with no training, no coding skills, no nothing, just build, drag and drop. I mean, there are a couple of tools, but they're difficult to use. ITB2 is much more sort of user friendly, and it's much more straightforward in ITB2 to log into a website and build your query as opposed to having to write a SQL query. So they both rely on a similar sort of premise, and they both involve extracting EHR data, transforming it into this model. It's just a question of a little bit of difference there in terms of what happens after the data have been transformed. In ITB2, it's hooked up to this website. You can query it through the website. In OMOP, there's a lot more you can do. You can access it directly. You can plug it into these other web tools, so on and so forth. Yes, Dr. Acker, the data sources do include lab result data, and we can definitely sort of represent that. There's a big table called measurement that has essentially a row for every lab value that's returned into the patient's charts. And with microbio, this gets a little bit trickier because some of the results or some of the tests are sort of organism specific, like a C. diff PCR. Other tests are more sort of organism agnostic, like a blood culture, where you're looking to see whether it's Klebsiella, whatever. There's some nuance to it, but in large part, the data do come in, and we can work with you. ITB2 is also a great tool for that. ITB2, you can query ITB2 by microbiology results and find, for example, all the patients who had a positive C. diff PCR in 2019, stuff like that. But yeah, the lab data is definitely in there. Imaging data, so Michael asked about imaging data. For the most part, just the metadata. So if an imaging study was performed, we can tell you, who had a CT done when, who had an MRI done when, the actual contents of the slide and, the findings, not so much. When radiologists are dictating imaging reports, it's really sort of a free text narrative. So things like a BI-RAD score from mammography or a PI-RAD score from a prostate MRI, those really just exist in the note. So they might be there in the note, and the note might be there in OMOP, but there wouldn't be like an actual field for it. But that said, there would be a record in the procedures table saying that a CT was performed on this date, or that an MRI or an X-ray or an ultrasound was done on this date.
Well, we're a little over time. Thank you guys so much for these questions. I'm going to wrap up a little bit because I just want to be mindful of everybody's time. But if you do have follow-up questions, please feel free to, I'm going to send the follow-up email later today. Please feel free to reply. You can use the ARCH support email that I will include, but definitely make sure that you respond to us with any questions that you might have after the session. So I want to thank Evan and Sajad, and I see that Cindy also joined. So thank you all for joining and telling us more about OMOP, and thanks to everybody who joined today's session to learn a little more about it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for your interest, everyone.